All right, part 2. Welcome back. I am David Long. We're here today to talk about the Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson talk, the second part of the talk where they talk about meaning and religious symbolism, and I'm super excited to talk about this. In part 1, we talked about truth and epistemology, and to be honest, we were able to get through that fairly quickly because it was pretty much one idea, one point, but this time it's going to take a little bit longer because this is a little bit deeper and thick and more nuanced of a topic. The disagreement in part 1 was pretty simple, a bunch of examples around one main distinction. So I made a type of outline of the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson conversation, and we're just kind of going to move through point by point. We're going to take a look at what was said, see if there are places where Peterson might have dropped the ball. We could pick up that ball and run with it and make some important distinctions that may or may not have been lacking. So Sam Harris starts out his talk by asking Jordan Peterson, what's the link between religion and science? And then Jordan Peterson goes off on a long explanation talking about wolves and chimps and how hierarchy through evolution manifests itself into religious ideas at its core, how the conditions and truths of nature have manifested themselves in religious symbolism, I guess is his point there. And he talks about these ideas of the individual and his place within hierarchy, this idea of the good father versus the evil father, this kind of benevolent versus tyrannical parental energy that might be in the world. So is the system going to serve humanity or destroy humanity? A consistent theme in mythology, and this idea of nature as mystery, as the post-conventional, and the hero's job is to straddle this line between order and chaos, bringing in the post-conventional back into the conventional and expanding the convention through evolution, through this giant conversation and the heroic adventure into the unknown. This is the basic theme of the cosmogonic cycle or the hero's journey outlined in Joseph Campbell's early book, A Hero with 1,000 Faces. This is classic mythological interpretation. Joseph Campbell is extending the work of Carl Jung, who Peterson often references. Carl Jung's quote is that dreams are private myths and that myths are public dreams. And so Campbell is psychoanalyzing mythology in the same way that Jung psychoanalyzed dream symbolism. So whether the symbolism is conscious or unconscious, there are these reoccurring archetypes, so universal ideas, and then cultural and personal variations on a theme. All distinctions that might have been helpful in the Harris and Peterson talk. I wonder if the reason that Peterson is talking about evolution in this way has something to do with his epistemology, the way he's kind of tying everything back to the survival of the species to determine what's good or true. Or I wonder if it's some kind of an appeal to Harris as a scientist, like, you believe in evolution, see how this mythology is a natural outgrowth of the evolution? I wonder if that's what he's doing. So Sam Harris brings up this example of celibacy. And he says, this isn't something that's good for evolution. What about this? Here's the problem I see with that example. It's not taking a big picture enough view. What celibacy as an example is a natural outgrowth or an extreme outgrowth, or maybe certain ideas taken to their logical conclusion that results in particular consequences. And then we as a culture over time get to see the consequences of these natural experiments in ideas in the noosphere. So I would say that, yeah, we can see that these types of things are not evolutionarily advantageous. And so, for the most part, it's not something that humans practice. And if they do practice it, it's more of like a short-term practice, maybe for people to be able to take a time or a period to focus on themselves. Maybe not lifelong celibacy or something like that. But again, this points back to this refining, unfolding story that happens through religious symbolism and religious ideas where people go to different extremes. There are the Christian extremes that people go to. There are the Buddhist extremes that people go to, in large part influenced by idealistic cosmologies. And there are also the pagan extremes that people go to. And we have the different mythologies and ideas that result from that. Within each of these traditions, there is a non-dual synthesis that occurs as well at these higher levels of expression. Every religious tradition can be expressed at every stage of human development, at pre-rational stages, at rational stages, and at trans-rational stages, or post-formal stages of development. There are trans-rational or metaphorical or non-superstitious, non-literal versions or translations of each of these traditions. And I have a video that gives examples of how each tradition has an expression of non-dual synthesis, where they've taken into account the different extremes and found some kind of middle position that explores the symbolism of Christianity versus paganism or Satanism as this kind of thesis antithesis. And I talk about how through taking both of these extremes into account, we can reach a synthesis. Using both Nietzsche and his idea of slave morality and master morality as these different extreme archetypes, and Aristotle's idea of the golden mean as this synthesis or middle point between these two extremes. So Christianity and paganism, they both kind of find themselves favoring different virtues and going off in their own kind of extreme directions. And through realizing the strengths and the weaknesses, pros and the cons of these different extremes, we can figure out what some kind of balance or some kind of synthesis would be like, where we can take into account the values of both sides and disregard the negative points of both sides. And so here we're talking about metaphor. We're talking about the roles and the archetypes that society and religions and things have created over time and what we can learn from them. It doesn't mean that we should adhere to them, but there's a bigger human conversation going on, and it's not all just about facts and truth and science. That's a very new conversation. And if we really want to incorporate or integrate the most truth from the most perspectives, then we really need to look at what every single worldview brings to the table. Yeah, sure, their worldview might not necessarily be accurate, but is there something good about their worldview, or some kind of a positive thing that comes out of it that we can learn from, and that we can apply some of that in our world, in our life today, and it would make our life better? And I think Sam Harris knows what this is about, because he's a big fan of Buddhism. And definitely, as Sam and Peterson come to this conclusion later in the talk, we don't have to believe anything on bad evidence or have any kind of superstition or anything like that to be able to integrate these truths. And of course, it's better if we don't. So this leads me nicely into the next point. What does Sam Harris ask? How do we know it's not pathology? How do we know it's not confusion? What about violence? How is this not ignorant bullshit? It's dangerous. How do you justify this belief in magic through talking about it and dignifying it? Isn't it dangerous to play this kind of poetic game, dignifying belief in magic? So that's one of his main concerns. And this is where a pre-trans distinction comes in handy. And this is where I'm actually going to cut to my semantic compatibilism video. These responses are based on reactions that I've gotten from a couple different archetypes. One I would want to call maybe more orange, modern, materialistic, scientific, more empirical, and one from more, I would say, a more green perspective, more mystical, phenomenological. And I want to kind of try and paint an integral synthesis as a position between these two perspectives, which is what my semantic compatibilism symbolism is trying to do. It's trying to flesh out what a post-formal or a transrational perspective would look like. In some regard, this relates to these main archetypal masculine and feminine symbols that I sometimes use, which are the cup and the sword. The cup has to do with poetry, and it's more feminine. The sword has to do with logic and rationality, and it's more masculine and more choppy. But it also relates to what Alan Watts is talking about when he talks about prickles and goo.
In the history of philosophy and poetry and art, we always find the interchange of two personality types, which I call prickles and goo. The prickly people are advocates of intellectual porcupinism. They want a rigor. They want precise statistics. And they have a certain clipped attitude in their voices. And you know this very well in academic circles, where there are people who are always edgy like that. And they accuse other people of being disgustingly vague and miasmic and mystical. But the vague, miasmic, and mystical people accuse the prickly people of being mere skeletons with no flesh on their bones. And they say to you, you just rattle. You're not really a human being. You know the words, but you don't know the music. But this natural universe is neither prickles nor goo exclusively. It's gooey prickles and prickly goo. And you see, it all depends on your level of magnification. If you've got your magnification on something so that the focus is clear, you've got a prickly point of view. You've got structure, shape, clearly outlined, sharply defined. You're a little out of focus, it's going to go bleh, and you've got goo. But we're always playing with the two.
Imagine you're in a movie theater, and you're watching Star Wars, let's say, with prickles and goo. So, goo over here says something like, wow, this movie's amazing. I want to be a Jedi and use the Force. Prickles over here is this, and he is not happy. He says, you're stupid. You can't be a Jedi. That's dumb. This is just a movie. That's computer animation and green screens, actors and actresses playing scenes. It's not real at all. Luckily, there was no one in the theater, so I was able to say, well, hold on a minute now, there, prickles and goo. George Lucas, he put his real thoughts and ideas into this movie. Like, this is about the human drama. There's truth to be had in this. Okay, sure, it's green screens and computer graphics, but also, you know, maybe there is something to this metaphor of tapping into the one life force or the one energy of the cosmos that connects us all. You know, maybe metaphorically you could be a Jedi. And yeah, it's just a movie. This gets me into what we call the pre-trans fallacy. There are two versions of the pre-trans fallacy. The first version is what Prickles over here tries to do to Goo, where he says, you're just childish, you're just stupid. So that's one version of the fallacy, is to reduce anything that's non-rational to childish bullshit, like maybe Freud or Richard Dawkins or people like this might do. On the other hand, the second version of this kind of fallacy is a lot of these new agey people and them thinking that all of these symbols, all of this poetry is all God, even though it's all coming from a whole bunch of different cultures. It's totally embedded in old school traditions and antiquated cosmologies, and it's not relevant to the time we live in, and these different symbols are not actually compatible with each other. So those are your two versions. You have scientists who are totally literal, and you have religious people who are crazy and totally literal. Now you can see examples of pre-trans confusion all over the place. Even these examples that I've given of Richard Dawkins and Deepak Chopra, they actually have a debate that's right here. The main discussion seems to be happening in a Spanish-speaking country, and there's some kind of crazy circus at the beginning, but the talk itself is actually pretty good. You can see how literally Dawkins is right, and metaphorically Deepak is right, but his poetry can be qualified in rational terms, like when he says, we're the universe becoming conscious of itself. This is true in the way that Dawkins says the universe becomes conscious of itself through us. And it is us that are conscious, but the universe itself is not conscious. Consciousness is the byproduct of matter. It grows out of stuff.
Or you could say, we are the universe becoming conscious of itself. So it's interesting to see how, in a sense, both Deepak's poetry and Richard Dawkins are both correct, and they just can't seem to agree. They get real frustrated with each other. So the difference between pre and trans is pre-rational translations are literal, magic and mythic. Trans-rational translations are metaphorical, even to the point of including what Nietzsche is talking about how we're using a bunch of metaphors to communicate. So not just understanding the poetic value of religious symbols, but the poetic value of all symbols. You have pre-conventional ideas and post-conventional ideas. You know, like a baby doesn't understand language, and so it gets indoctrinated into all of these terms, and it takes them literally for granted. Whereas someone who has a post-formal understanding, like I'm talking about, like what Nietzsche had, they might use some of these same terms like we're talking, like he's using to deconstruct or reveal the nature of truth, but the translation is different. The baby takes the symbols as literally true. The rational mind can see the unfounded claims in the literal reading, and a transrational reading is metaphorical, seeing deeper truths beyond the symbol. Let's think about like the tortoise and hare, for example. A pre-rational interpretation of the tortoise and the hare is to take it literally, and a post-formal way of looking at that view is to read it as a metaphor, as a set of symbols, and to say, oh, this isn't about a tortoise and a hare at all. And if you think that it is, you've totally missed the point. It's not about that. It's about you and me and about how we live. It's about hard work and determination and focus. So I personally also prefer the term post-formal to the term trans-rational. Even though they're kind of saying the same thing, all of these things, post-formal, trans-rational, semantic compatibilism, they're all kind of getting at the same thing. I like the word post-formal. It's kind of like post-conventional, like post-formal. It's about seeing through the symbol, whereas oftentimes, people get confused by the word trans-rational. They think it's like an open-door policy for psychics, or for this idea like there's some special information that you can get by opening your mind in a certain way or tapping into something through some meditative state or something, some kind of like illumination or gnosis that you'll get through spiritual experience, this kind of special knowledge that's beyond rationality. And that is not what trans-rational means at all. I know that's a prevalent idea in a lot of the New Agey kind of community, but that just doesn't fit into an integral epistemology. If you go back and you watch the epistemology video, you'll see that we actually have a methodology for how we get our knowledge, which would include how to test some of these unfounded claims. Transrational ability is about your ability to see through the symbol and the sign to what it's pointing at. And also, metaphors are not transrational like they're non-rational. Metaphors are highly rational. Like there's a right and wrong reading of the tortoise and the hare. And when I say what it's about, that makes sense. A metaphor makes sense when it's explained. And there might be multiple meanings for a metaphor, multiple entendres. And you can go through and explain rationally each of the meanings that you take out of this symbol. So when someone asks you, what do you mean? You should be able to explain what you think that means and how you think that's true. And honestly, if you can't explain what you mean by the metaphor, then you're just talking shit. You're just using words in ways that you don't understand.
A kind of word salad of jargon, used out of context, inappropriately, apparently uncomprehendingly.
And that's why Prickles calls you goo.
So yes, there are pre-rational, childish, superstitious, bullshit, dangerous translations of these ideas, but could have childish, bullshit, dangerous, potentially violent and harmful interpretations of almost any idea. That is just a case of childishness and immaturity. And yes, definitely, many of our traditions are rooted in this type of immaturity, and there's also the problem of orthodoxy. A lot of these traditions started off by people with good intentions, probably writing poetry or trying to share some kind of wisdom. If you have an amazing experience, that's one thing, but if you want to be able to share that experience with other people, you have to codify it and make it into a religion. And then politics emerge, and different translations, and different people trying to understand it from their limited perspectives, and years go by. And then later people say, no, this is how it has to be or we'll kill you. And then they teach their kids that, and then it gets taken off by political and social powers, and it can morph and become its own thing. It becomes this literal, traditional, magical, mythical, dogmatic thing, which is, I would say, in most cases, not what really any religious symbolism was originally intended to be. I would say probably in most cases, people who are writing mythology know that they're writing mythology. I would say even Christianity, if you really dig deep into its history, I mean deep into its history, like pre-Orthodox history, where there were Ebionites and Marcionites and Gnostics and the Proto-Orthodox and the Apocalypticists, the early Gnostic and Essene traditions are much more rooted in this metaphorical translation. And the metaphorical translation is very, very similar to Buddhism, actually. Heaven and hell are much like nirvana and samsara. If you want to explore this idea a little bit deeper, you can check out my video about the difference between a literal and metaphorical translation of Christianity, just as an example. So Peterson, in the face of all this questioning about what about violence and all this stuff, he almost goes back to trying to make a truth claim and says that he has done a lot of study and that he has tried to validate these archetypes through seeing them appear in multiple different disciplines or something like that. So, trying to do some kind of a meta-analysis. But that's not really a distinction. Saying that you've studied it and that you know a lot about it, well, let's skip the boasting and get to the distinction. If you know a lot about it, and I'm asking you this question, then just tell me the answer. But we don't really get that. So Sam Harris also says that religion is failed science, and he asks the question, how is any of this stuff about archetypes and symbolism and stuff like that actually religion? He says something at one point, religion is about belief in cosmology.
It's the edge, the interface between what can be known and what is never to be discovered, because it is a mystery transcendent of all human research. The source of life. What is it? No one knows. Carl Jung's idea, which he calls the archetypes of the collective unconscious.
What do you mean by archetype?
They are expressions of the structure of the human psyche. All the gods, all the heavens, all the worlds are within us. They are magnified dreams. One can say that the images of myth are reflections of spiritual and depth potentialities of every one of us. Through contemplating those, we evoke those powers in our own lives. And to see life as a poem and yourself participating in a poem is what the myth does for you. Every mythology, every religion is true in this sense. It is true as metaphorical of the human and cosmic mystery. But when it gets stuck to the metaphor, then you're in trouble.
The metaphor being?
Well, Jesus ascended to heaven. The story is he ascended bodily to heaven. So this is metaphorical of something. You don't have to throw it away. All you have to find is what it's saying.
What do you think it is saying?
What it's saying is he didn't go out there, he went in here, which is where you must go too, and ascend to heaven through the inward space to that source from which you and all life came. That's the sense of that.
But aren't you undermining one of the great cardinal doctrines of the traditional classic Christian faith, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus?
That would be what I would call the mistaken reading of the symbol. That's reading it in terms of prose instead of in terms of poetry. That's reading a metaphor in terms of the denotation instead of in terms of the connotation. Do you understand that? It's a purely literary problem.
One question, how is any of that religious? The Dobu felt that magic became more powerful the closer you were to somebody, so that the people who were closest to them in life, their spouses or their children, were the people who were most likely to destroy them with their magical powers.
Well, that's actually true, Sam. If you've ever had a family, you know that.
But yeah, so again, you could connect it to some kind of story that makes sense. So you could go to Greek mythology and Shakespeare and spin a yarn about it. But clearly, this underlying belief in magic was, one, it's almost certainly not true, but two, it was creating a truly toxic moral environment for these people. And so, again, I just put that out there as an example of something that one would never want to spend a lot of time trying to justify this worldview by reference to stories, ancient or otherwise. I think of religion, as you know, as a kind of failed science, as a kind of first attempt to tell a story about what's going on that gives us some power over it. But it's a bad attempt because we didn't develop any kind of methodology at that point to differentiate fact from fiction. So the problem, from my point of view, is twofold. One is that we know that there's a path forward to rule out things like witchcraft and the evil eye, and that this path is science and rationality generally. But the other problem is that you could still play this game by resort to ancient stories and finding some connection between those stories and evolution. You could play a game of dignifying a belief in magic, in this case, the evil eye specifically, along Jungian lines or archetypal lines or something. You could be sympathetic with this picture, but my point is, what would be the point of that? I mean, given the obvious harms that we no longer need commit based on disavowing this ancient ignorance, why would one spend any time at all trying to make sense of admittedly ancient concern about sympathetic magic, right? Sympathetic magic is dangerous bullshit. That's basically all I think we need to know about it now. And yet you could spend a lifetime. You could be reading not only Jung, but, sketchier people like Aleister Crowley and the tradition of Western magic, right? Seems to me to be almost by definition a colossal waste of time and actually unnecessary to preserve anything that we care about at this moment in history.
Okay, well, Sam, I love you, but it seems like your understanding about truth and your understanding about religion are very much contextualized in terms of the modern world that we live in. I don't think it was the case that everyone has always taken these symbols literally. That in itself might be a product of Orthodox Christianity and this literal, factual, historical interpretation and the insistence on that. The fact that we grow up in Western culture that is mainly rooted in Christianity, that probably has something to do with why you think of religion in that kind of way. And this is where I really think that Jordan Peterson drops the ball. Man, it is disappointing because he has an opportunity right here to make this distinction. And I really think he's going to when he starts to say, Sam, that's true about how family has more powerful of an effect on you than anyone else. I thought he was going to make the distinction metaphorically versus literally, that we don't want to advocate for these magical, mythical worldviews. But what we can do is use the symbolism and understand it poetically. For example, with this idea of the evil eye. It's one thing if you really think that there's magic in the evil eye and that you're gonna put a curse or a hex on somebody or something, versus if you're sitting next to your buddy and you notice that a woman across the room is giving you a mean glance and he turns to you and he says, "Hey man, that girl over there is giving you the evil eye." The problem isn't with the symbolism of the evil eye. The problem is with the interpretation of the person who's using it. So just like when Einstein would use the term God, we don't necessarily have a problem with it because we understand what he means when he says it, that he's not talking about some transcendent supernatural being, that he's talking about the universe in a sacred way. For his own purposes and reasons, I'm sure.
Yes, I do indeed have my reasons.
So you have to take into account the interpretation of the person who's saying it. Not only when you're speaking these terms transrationally or poetically, know your audience. And if you're the audience, try and understand the speaker. So let's make some more distinctions. How about that? There are many people who think that what we need to do is to get rid of religion. And I do not think this is the case at all. I think what we need is a healthy religion. You're like, healthy religion? What is that? Well, it's because you're thinking about the unhealthy parts of religion. Let me explain. A lot of the governments we have all over the world are shitty and corrupt and failing and dysfunctional. But we don't say, oh, we need to get rid of government. No, government serves important functions and roles. And what we would need to do ultimately is to create a functioning, healthy form of government that is appropriate for our time and our worldview. I would argue the same is the case for religion. Joseph Campbell says that when religions and mythologies are working properly, they serve four main functions. The first function is the mystical function, which opens up the mystery of everything, which is also your mystery. Now, notice I said the word mystery here. That's an important word. I'm not saying the absolute truth that can be communicated. And in fact, many religions throughout time have had it part of their religious understanding that absolute truth was beyond anyone's ability to speak about. The second function is the cosmological function, which is to serve and incorporate the knowledge of the day and the time. This is honestly why so many religions are so outdated, because cosmology has changed and grown and upgraded and updated so fast that no religious tradition was able to keep up with it. So the third function is the sociological function, which is to bind together a group with roles and rules. Now, the problem is that if it doesn't serve the second cosmological function, then those roles and rules will be out of date for another time, for another place. So it's really important to get that right. The fourth function is the pedagogical function, which is to move the individual through the inevitable stages and crises of life in terms of their time and their potentials and dangers. This can be things like initiation rituals into adulthood, births, weddings, funerals, all these kinds of things. So these are all important parts of the structure of a society that hold people's worldview together, that hold people together not only in relationship to a culture, but in a relationship to nature and to reality. Let's make another distinction. There are these universal ideas that appear in different cultural costumes. And one of the main distinctions that appears throughout all different types of religions that correlate to a particular stage of cognitive development or cultural development. These universal themes of non-dual synthesis, where you realize your interconnectedness with nature and with culture and with other people. So this notion of the interconnectedness of the web of life, the body of Christ, or Buddha nature, Jesus on his tree, and Buddha under his tree, is the same symbolic image, the person who has died to the flesh and been reborn of the spirit. Now, these are both products of the more idealistic kind of cosmology, and there's also the more pagan version, which has more to do with self-mastery, where these other traditions have more to do with self-transcendence or self-sacrifice. So also, when Sam in his talk quickly dismissed Aleister Crowley and pagan and occultic traditions. Again, I feel like this is another case of, to some extent, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, he doesn't do that with Buddhism and meditation. If he realized that self-transcendence and self-mastery were two sides to the same coin, and that there's a baby in that bathwater or a diamond in that dunghill to be found on both sides, and there's a synthesis to be had by including both, that's the kind of thing that brings value to people's life, because the Buddhist tradition does have a non-dual synthesis, just like the pagan tradition has a non-dual synthesis. But I guess I'm saying that to some extent, in Buddhism, there's more of a focus on deconstructing the ego or the concept of self and getting back to this blankness or emptiness. Whereas in the pagan occultic tradition, there's this idea of creating the self and projecting into the future. And so both what we would call being and becoming are important factors in a self-mastery practice. Now, relating back to what I was talking about earlier about quadrants, I have a video about integral spiritual practice, which talks about a different type of practice that correlates to each one of these quadrants and what a holistic integral spiritual practice would look like. And by the way, again, very much in the nature of what Sam Harris is talking about. I'm not talking about anything superstitious or magical or mythical in a literal type of way. I don't believe in magic. I don't take any of these mythologies literally. I'm not superstitious, but I do think that these different practices and this different poetry can give us ways of looking at reality that can be helpful for us to be able to understand our relationship to it. And I'm very sympathetic to the way that Jordan Peterson would argue for the way that an understanding of an incorporation of archetypal symbolism, not just from religions, but from all of mythology, from all worldviews, can be viewed more poetically, some poetry more accurate than others. But when you have aspects of reality that you can talk about in the language games of multiple traditions that are good for getting at multiple layers of truth, imagine if you had 5 poetic terms to understand something as opposed to just one. Your understanding of that something would be much more nuanced. And you could say, well, these people look at it like this, and these people look at it like this, and they both have these different approaches to it, and these are the pros of this approach, and these are the cons of this approach, and find some kind of balance point or synthesis. So you can see that I am actually very sympathetic to Peterson's view when it comes to mythology and religious symbolism. But if I was going to have this talk with Sam Harris, I would try to qualify some of these things on the front end and deal with some of these distinctions where it seems like Jordan Peterson has kind of just let Sam Harris bring up a bunch of distinctions and potential problems and then just be like, well, I agree with you. Magic is bad and some of these things are harmful and destructive. But he doesn't make something like the pre-trans distinction and say that there are pre-rational, magical, and mythical translations of symbolism, which are superstitious and childish and do need to be debunked. And then there are poetic, metaphorical archetypes and symbols that can reveal aspects of human psychology and give us a deeper language to be able to talk about our experience and our relationship to life and nature. I recently made a video where I'm critical of an author named Steve McIntosh. And part of what I was concerned about was not just the truth of his ideas and his intellectual honesty, but the potential problems with how his view might give us an unhealthy relationship to nature. Like, for example, I think part of the main problem with a lot of these Abrahamic traditions has to do with their relationship to nature. And that's how you get these extremes like celibacy or something like that. So just to explore celibacy a little bit more in depth, if you've made purity and cleanness such a virtue to the point where you have to be perfect and you totally repress and cut off aspects of your human nature, and you have not given your own nature any kind of beautiful or sanctified or God-glorified way to express itself, and you've just pushed it down and hidden it, then when it finally does express itself, because it has no positive, healthy way to express, it's going to manifest itself in some kind of ugly, hidden, secret, dirty, dangerous, hurtful kind of way. And that's the problem with these priests that molest little boys. And I would say that's a consistent theme that you have in religion, is this problem with the denial of and repression of nature as something evil and sinful and fallen, something to be corrected and covered up and changed. The denial and degradation of the sacred feminine, turning it into a holy ghost, the emphasis on the masculine and the absolute, and the demonization of the feminine.
Will I am certain I speak a new language, as is always the first sign of a new age. I am come to tell you she is here. It is not written. No penman's ship was ever cargoed with her character note. Books are carefully folded far as void of autumn bound from the sun. Likewise she made a residence on the outskirts of history, on the dark side of the moon where the searchlight of the sun could not spot her nor rot her. The seed of forbidden fruit, every tree has a hidden root, yet she has come I am a simple, disoriented man in her presence. I wear my loincloth over my eyes and ejaculate too soon. Forgive me, Father, if I have sinned. I prayed to you and cupped the wind, and in doing so barred her entry into a century, 100 years of solitude. I will now pray with my hands outstretched, with these psalms etched into my palms. Most beloved, I am certain of nothing more than your existence. 1,000 ants under a log may find themselves exposed to my childlike search for you. My colleague, flower, I'm eternally destroyed by your love. No longer am I eligible for any worker's pension. My friends laugh at me and talk behind my back. They say that you've changed me, and I am. I'm like a survivor of the flood, walking through the streets, drenched with God, surprised all the drowned victims are still walking and talking. Maybe there's hope. I rush to each victim's side, sucking what I can of you out of your various incarnations, pumping their stomachs and filling them. To touch them is to touch you, to kiss them is to kiss you, my friends. Love is an art form slightly removed from its element, and one may ask, what does this mean? I respond, I've made it up. But it shall be from now on. When the Roman Catholic Church took the idea of the feminine out of the idea of the Trinity, they distorted reality. It's a mother, God, you know? And I don't mean that in the idea of like, oh, it's the goddess and all that. I only use shit like that where like if a stick is bent this way and you want it to come center, you have to push it to the opposite extreme in order for it to come center. If you push it to the center, it's going to go like this. You got to push it to the opposite extreme for it to come center. And so that's why I play with the idea of God or the goddess or what have you in writings, like said the shotgun or what have you. It's not to say that I just put, you know, a dress on God or some shit. No, it's to say it's, you know, God is within or whatever, all of us, you know. My point is we have to keep our religions in perspective. Mother Nature's a whore, said the shotgun to the head, and it smelt like teen spirit, angst-driven, insecure, a country in puberty, a country at war.
Which is why the pagans so vehemently pick up those themes and run with them and say, no, we actually think this stuff is important. So through these archetypes, they're expressing their values and what they see the meaning of life as. You don't have to take it literally to understand that. So there was a certain point where Sam and Jordan were talking about truth in fiction, lessons of fact in fiction, and Jordan Peterson brought up this idea of metafiction, talked about Cain and Abel and sacrifice. And that's kind of interesting. If you know anything about spiral dynamics and stages of development, the move from an impulsive egoic stage into a traditional conformist stage has a lot to do with learning to sacrifice now for something more later. And Peterson talking about how this was more of like a religious practice before it was understood more rationally, and that you had to really act it out. Does make sense to me. It is very interesting. I think the reason why you have so many people having all of these visions and you have all of these wild tales and stuff is because a good amount of people back then, you know, a good amount of people were illiterate and a good amount were probably somewhat schizophrenic, and their worldview was limited. So they only had their worldview to interpret their experience. And so their interpretation of their experience, whatever it was limited and run through the filter of their cultural tradition and confirmation bias and all these kinds of bad patterns of reasoning that we recognize now. Which isn't to say that there weren't wise people, and these are probably the people who were literate enough to be able to write a myth in the first place. It's not to say that all of these stupid schizophrenic people who are having crazy experiences and are delusional and pathological are getting to like write down all these things and that's where they come from. No, a lot of them are actually rooted in post-conventional, post-formal, trans-rational, symbolic interpretations of reality, which was, in part of the mythological traditional language of the past. So what does happen, though, is that later you do have people who have schizophrenic experiences like Paul or Muhammad or whoever else, and they interpret their experience in the light of their traditional worldview, what else do they have but their worldview to interpret their experience?
There are at least 4, usually 5, major states of consciousness that everybody has access to. Waking, dreaming, deep sleep are the simplest. I'm writing this just across the top as gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual. The waking state, dreaming state, deep, formless sleep state. What we find is that if you take somebody at a particular stage of development, and here I'm using the simple Gene Gebser stages. So I've written archaic, magic, mythic or traditional, rational or modern, pluralistic or postmodern, and integral or higher. You can be at a traditional mythic stage, and if you experience these states, you'll interpret it in those terms. Because you only have the mind to interpret what's arising. If you have a peak experience, as I was saying, let's say you're at the mythic stage or wave of development, and you have an experience of a subtle being of light, and you come from a culture that's Christian, you very likely interpret that as Jesus, perhaps. You can be at the rational level of development, like Bertrand Russell was, for example, and he had the experience of nature mysticism, but he interpreted it, of course, in rational terms. That's almost all you can do. And if you experience these states, you'll interpret it in those terms. Because you only have the mind to interpret what's arising. It's very common, it's culturally molded. Because you only have the mind to interpret what's arising. It's very common, it's culturally molded. If you're in China or in Southeast Asia and you have an experience of light, it might very well have 10,000 arms. It might very well be Avalokiteshvara. You're never going to find a Southern Baptist seeing 10,000 arms. I mean, it's just very, very rare.
Having an experience of undivided consciousness does not tell you what consciousness really is or what its relationship to the brain really is. There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head. You can drop acid, you can meditate for a year, you can do whatever you want to perturb your nervous system. You can feel yourself to be one with the universe, and at no point in that transformation do you get a glimpse that there's 100 trillion neurons in your head or synapses in your head that are doing anything. It's called absolute subjective ignorance of what's actually going on outside your consciousness. It cannot possibly be justified.
That's why it's a statement of metaphysics, not of physics.
No, metaphysical statements also have to be justified, as it turns out.
And then, of course, you have charlatans and misleaders, too, who will take up the symbolism and put their twist on it and try to move people in different ways. But these are how the symbols and the traditions take on a life of their own and or become corrupted. So it's not all bad intentions or schizophrenic people. There's a whole process that ideas go through before they get to us, and sometimes the original intention is lost, and maybe even the original authors are lost. It's not that religion is a failed science. It's that science and the scientific worldview have brought about a whole new way of conceiving of reality. Joseph Campbell used to insist all the time that people weren't looking to religion and poetry and stuff like that to explain reality, but they were going to it as a way of feeling in accord with nature and reality, to having a meaning matrix that helped them to align properly, something like that. And right now, in a mostly modern culture, the modern meaning matrix is fine for a lot of people, but then other people have also done tons of work to deconstruct it. As we're seeing now with this whole issue of gender identity and gender issues, a lot of this is more pre-trans confusion, right? Like if I was going to take on this Peterson issue, I would say that a lot of people who are claiming to be transgender don't actually know what the difference between sex and gender is. Sex is biological and gender is cultural, right? So when your parents say little boys wear blue and little girls wear pink, that is a cultural gender role that they're trying to put on you. So people who grow up in that, and then they go, but I actually like pink, and I actually would like to wear dresses. What does that mean about me? That's actually role confusion. So to switch and wear the other and appropriate the other gender doesn't mean that you're transgender. It means that you're role confused. You're still buying into the cultural ideas about what gender are. And the problem is that you're trying to change your body to match what society says the norms are supposed to be, instead of help society break down the false binaries that it's constructed around gender, to the point where boys and girls can like whatever they like. Like, so if you're a guy and you really like to shave your legs and wear pink dresses, you can just shave your legs and wear pink dresses if that's what you like. You don't have to hate your body or, change your sex to match your social gender. Okay, so there's pre-conventional ideas, which are the little kid who has no idea what society says that boys and girls are supposed to like. Pre-gender. Gender is being stuck inside of the cultural gender ideas, be that happy with it or not, confused or not. And then transgender would be to be able to synthesize the values of both extremes. Like, for example, I would say that in many ways I'm transgender because I am both comfortable with my vulnerability and with my strength. And I can find a synthesis in that. I can find strength and vulnerability. I'm not stuck in these false binaries. My favorite color is purple. The reason I bring this up is because it kind of reveals the structure of this deconstruction that's happened through society, to the point now where even our modern stories about reality are not working for people anymore. And so this whole gender issue is in part a crumbling away of the old maps and a trying to figure out how we can create new maps that better map to reality and better allow people to be able to express themselves. And so this isn't something that is necessarily even going to be solved by science. This is something that has to be solved through cultural map making and meaning making, which should be, in large part, I would say, informed by science, but not just science. Even science is understood within a framework, within a story. And science is just a methodology that produces facts and theories. I love the Western Enlightenment project. I'm a fan of both the Eastern and the Western Enlightenment project. The Western Enlightenment project is all about being able to describe everything in detail, having the best maps, and I'm all about that. But of course, part of that now has to include the understanding that the map is not the territory, and that even our scientific descriptions of reality are still just incredibly accurate poetry, really coherent descriptions that are very consistent and have tons of agreement around them. Dictionaries of definitions of words, so that way logic works and everything is well defined to the point where we can have diagrams talking about all the different parts and how they relate to the whole. That's the Western Enlightenment project. And we're going to have to extend that beyond just the modern, rational world space. Obviously, even past the postmodern relativistic swamp, which is so often lost in confusion and self-contradiction, into the integral and integrally informed world space, to where we can take all of these perspectives and include them in a skillful way. Part of that is this semantic compatibilism and this trans-rational understanding of the nature of language, what I call including both the cup and the sword, both logic and poetry. And of course, poetry has to make logical sense. Your metaphor has to be pointing at something. And of course, logic is using relative symbols, poetry, to be able to qualify its ideas. So they are intertwined. And understanding the way that logic and poetry are intertwined is to understand what we're actually doing when we're making sense in the way that would hopefully synthesize the perspective of Sam Harris's realism and Jordan Peterson's understanding of the fact that there are many symbolic ways of talking about the true nature of reality. And the distinction that we want to make is is that we want those ways of talking about reality to actually cash out in some kind of way. Now, one of the parts of this talk that I found to be pretty frustrating was listening to Sam Harris give his religious interpretation of that recipe of whatever it was.
I walked into the cookbook section of a Barnes & Noble and, with my eyes closed, just ran my hand down the shelf and grabbed a book and opened it at random. And therein I discovered an as-yet uncelebrated mystical treatise. While it appears to be a recipe for wok-seared fish and shrimp cakes with Ogo tomato relish, we need only study its list of ingredients to know that we are in the presence of an unrivaled spiritual intelligence. The snapper fillet, of course, is the individual himself, you and I, awash in the sea of existence. And here we find it cubed, which is to say that our situation must be remedied in all three dimensions of body, mind, and spirit. Now you have 3 teaspoons of chopped scallions. This further partakes of the cubic symmetry, suggesting that which we need add to each level of our being by way of antidote comes likewise in equal proportions. The import of the passage is clear. The body, mind, and spirit need to be tended with the same care. Salt and freshly ground black pepper. Well, here we have the perennial invocation of opposites, the white and black aspects of our nature. Both good and evil must be understood if we would fulfill the recipe of spiritual life. Nothing, after all, can be excluded from the human experience. This seems to be a tantric text. What is more, salt and pepper come to us in the form of grains, which is to say that the good and bad qualities are born of the tiniest actions, and thus we are not in good or evil in general, but only by virtue of innumerable moments which color the stream of our being by force of repetition. Then there's a dash of cayenne pepper. Clearly a being of such robust color and flavor, it signifies the spiritual influence of an enlightened adept. I go on, and this is all bullshit because it's meant to be bullshit. This is as valid sounding, or so I would argue, as most of what is produced in this genre.
And I mean, of course you can do that, but to act like that is what we're doing is dishonest. It's kind of a straw man of what's actually being done. It's a bad analogy. That's not what we're doing. And it's also kind of dismissive to psychoanalysis and the work that a lot of really smart people have done. The interpretation of this symbolism is not just some post hoc thing that's made up that has nothing to do with the original intention of the author. I would say in many cases, the symbolic interpretation is the original intention of the author. And if you study, I mostly study Christianity, but if you study in detail the history of these traditions, you can see that as the story unfolds, as different people write different mythologies and interpretations, a lot of what they're all doing is speaking in the symbolic language of their tradition and tweaking the symbolism and the poetry and the story to favor their particular interpretation and meaning of the worldview of why Jesus came and what he came to do and what it all means, and how that relates back to previous traditions and older symbolism. We know pretty well that none of them are actual eyewitnesses reporting back on what they actually experienced. These are people who understand the symbolic language and are putting their twist on it. I would say definitely yes. Let's remember the horrors. Let's remember the problems of superstition, but also let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. In the same way that Sam was able to rescue the diamond from the dunghill of Buddhism, I think it's important to know that there are diamonds in the dunghills of many of these traditions worth salvaging. Now, that's not to say that there are equally good diamonds in each of these dunghills, or that at a certain point it doesn't become redundant. Like you couldn't get what you need from Christianity and just take Islam and Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses and say, these people bring nothing new or valuable to the table that really helps, and Christianity is best representation from this Abrahamic tradition. All these other offshoots are redundant. I'm not saying that that's absolutely the case. I would be open to arguments to the contrary. I don't know everything about every religion. There might be something unique and interesting in there, and I just haven't heard about it yet. But for the most part, what you get with these offshoots are variations on a theme, which is interesting. But my point is that I'm saying that not all religions or symbol sets are equal. There's a reason that certain ones rise to the top, besides just killing their way there, right? That could be a reason as well. All ways of talking about reality could be valid in some context. context, depending on how it's being used. But kind of where I'm going with this idea about how some traditions or some practices or some variations might be better than others. Some teachers are better than others. For an example, Ayn Rand from Objectivism and Atlas Shrugged fame, apparently early days in college, she used to write Nietzsche and I think at the beginning of her papers. Then later, as she got older, she said that the only philosopher that she ever read was Aristotle. And I think this is because she knows that she's a poor man's Nietzsche, that she didn't quite have the style or the wisdom and the depth of Nietzsche. And so she never said his name as not to be compared to him, in hopes, I think, that people who had never heard of him would just find her stuff. I think this is very similar to Peterson. That's why he's always talking about Carl Jung. But to me, I'm like waiting for him to say Joseph Campbell or to use some of those distinctions, and he doesn't. But Joseph Campbell has done so much work in this field that it really does seem like Jordan Peterson is just a real poor man's Joseph Campbell. If you like these kinds of topics and you like Jordan Peterson because of these kinds of topics, not only should you check out my videos, but you should check out Joseph Campbell and his work. Maybe start with The Power of Myth, but he's got a lot of good stuff. Lots of really good work on this topic. So after this whole bad recipe analogy thing, Jordan says to Sam, well, you have to separate the wheat from the chaff. Some interpretations may be better than others, but he doesn't really make any distinctions. So frustrating. How are you going to go on this podcast with this atheist and not expect to have to answer some of these questions and deal with some of these distinctions? Obviously, it's going to be people's concern how you're going to deal with these problems. And if you haven't thought that it was going to come up, you must not know who you're talking to or what you're trying to convince them of. Very frustrating. Anyways, we are going to make some distinctions here today. So we're going to talk about different appropriate types of interpretation. The first appropriate type of interpretation I want to talk to you about is called translation. This is where you're not trying to change someone's worldview, but you're trying to work within their worldview to change the way that they live. So when we're working with translation and we want to influence people in a positive direction, we're not trying to help them transform their entire worldview. We're trying to help them to be more healthy where they're at. So part of healthy translation is giving equal emphasis to all four quadrants at whatever stage you're at, and also doing work to try to lift up people who are at lower stages of development. So an example of this would be if you were at a supermarket or something like that, and the person in front of you was checking out and they told the person, God bless, as they left, and then you saw them throw something that was recyclable in the trash or something. You might be able to say to them, hey brother, I saw you throw this in the trash. I don't know if you know or not, but you can recycle this. It's real important that we're good stewards of the environment. God gave us this beautiful earth and we really need to work hard to take care of it, brother. They might resonate with that. You actually might get them to change their ways and think about their life if that's where their value system is at. Not just caring about your soul, but caring about God's environment or whatever. And that would make them a better person. I'm guessing that part of the reason why Sam advocates so strongly against religious people is because it actually shows up as being problematic in the world. That's why we don't want unfounded wrong beliefs, because it shows up as having consequences. So if we can't totally change someone's worldview, at least we can work to try to mitigate some of those negative consequences. Another appropriate use of this symbolism has to do with trying to understand the original intention of the author. And so this can be somewhat of a historical analysis where you try to view the text through the lens of the group of the people who made it. So we've already mentioned the example of the Gnostics. So you can take any of this symbolism and ask, what does Jesus or the Christ mean to them versus to the Ebionites or the Marcionites or the Proto-Orthodox or something like that? A lot of scholars understand the story of Barabbas to be a metaphor for the Yom Kippur ritual, where they would release a scapegoat and kill the clean goat. That's a more like inside the tradition way of understanding symbolism, a more scholarly, historical, contextual way of trying to interpret the original intention of the text. Then there's a more monomyth type of approach, where the idea is that all the stories of mythology and all of human history are archetypes in the human unconscious, all variations on a theme. We all have mothers and fathers, and so gods and goddesses are projections of father and mother into the absolute. Back to Peterson's point about how all of these symbols and the ways that the metaphors arise can be traced back to aspects of human psychology and evolution. So there are these universal ideas with different local cultural costumes and personal variations. One way you could think about it would be, let's say that you knew someone very intimately well, and they told you about a dream that they had. And because you know them so well, it kind of symbolically represents some of the things that they might be going through in their waking life. And a lot of those same problems are coming up in their dreams, trying to get dealt with, like falling or being chased, Look into the psychology of some of this stuff. Now let's extend this from just the personal realm to the cultural realm. Think about the ways that you could do a meta-analysis of all the different kinds of movies that a culture makes. The things that they show, the things that they fixate on, the things that they won't show. This is going to tell you a lot about the psychology of a culture. And so you can psychoanalyze the myths in the same way that you can psychoanalyze dreams. And in that regard, of course, figuring out the things that make healthy hero characters in the world, or evil villains, or people go from the good side to the bad side, how downward spirals work. Whatever the situation may be, a lot of that stuff comes from real life experience. It's literature. Some of it's very old literature, but the point is to see the universal themes. So that's another appropriate use of the symbolism, to talk about these kind of overarching universal themes in the cultural costumes, this kind of web of meaning that comes in these archetypes of the collective unconscious, reflecting on that. So it can also be used as a tool of introspection. For example, going back to the pre-trans distinction, if we look at something like tarot cards, one might go to get their tarot cards read, and if the person who's doing the reading is superstitious, they might tell you that they're going to give you a literal read of the symbols. This is going to predict the future in the next 6 months. And if that's the case, you should test it. And if that's the case, you honestly shouldn't go. That's some pre-rational, superstitious nonsense, right, Sam? But a healthy interpretation of the tarot cards would be to realize that these archetypes of the tarot have to do with aspects of our own psychology. And if we could think about the way, not in a skeptical way, where we're breaking down, oh, that doesn't apply to me, but we're actually doing the opposite of something like that, but projecting meaning into it. How does this archetype relate to this aspect of my life in this position of the card? And then you build a web of meaning for introspection as a type of Rorschach blot that you can get something out of. That's another appropriate use of the symbol, this kind of as a tool for introspection. Another appropriate use of the symbolism has to do with personal experience. For example, that girl over there is giving me the evil eye. That's an appropriate use of the symbolism. If Jordan Peterson and I got together, I might talk to him in a way like telling him about my personal history. I might say, this was the moment at which I unmasked my father. This was the moment at which I went on my own hero's quest into the unknown. This was the moment at which I was really in the belly of the whale. This was the moment at which I was really in the center of the labyrinth and looking my inner beast in the eye. This was my real moment of rebirth and rededication. There's an appropriate use of poetry there, not only for one's own personal expression in terms of telling other people, but also one's own personal expression in terms of creating oneself, which we get into later. So speaking of personal expression, I make music that often utilizes a lot of this transrational poetry. You can check out my work on Bandcamp. I make like a type of philosophical hip-hop. My hip-hop name is I Am, hence I Am David Long at the beginning of the video. But a lot of what I'm doing is sort of reworking these mantras or sort of creating these spells or these kinds of meaning matrices for people to step into, and it kind of holds your thinking on a particular level, kind of keeps you focused. So when you sing something like all is impermanent, all is without a self, over and over again, religions throughout time have utilized these mantras and these sayings and these different songs and stuff to help keep the mind focused on a different plane, to help recontextualize what you're doing in terms of a big picture religious perspective. Now, yes, it is true that in many cases in the past that has been superstitious and it hasn't been positive or good. But if you can divorce it from the superstitious stuff, if you could just think about it like, this is a song that for me is an anthem that pumps me up, that empowers me, and when I need to get into the right state of mind to get X, Y, or Z done, I put on this song to get me there. That's a type of use of this symbolism where you project yourself into a particular type of archetype. Now, me personally, as an artist, it's really easy for me to see how even the most scientific papers, or even the way Sam Harris skillfully, Socratically dissects Peterson's arguments, I see the art in it. I understand that underneath the words, there's a style and a delivery, and the words are just tools. But it's true, they don't necessarily prove anything. It's definitely not a replacement for science, what we're talking about. It's just poetry. And if people are making claims with the poetry, you might have to go through and figure out what the claim is and see if it's true or not. Okay, so Sam Harris makes the claim that all these traditions are mutually exclusive. Well, it's true that they're all different, but as we've said, there are universal themes and cultural and personal variations on a theme. So they're not mutually exclusive when you take this kind of big picture, broad view. Peterson mentions Derrida and how now we're at a point in our history where we don't have the one true way anymore. And so a lot of the relativists kind of create like a flatland of value. But we really want to go beyond that. We want to be able to integrate diversity with discernment. And this gets us into these different stages of what we call vision logic. This vision logic that we're talking about happens at post-conventional or postmodern stages of development. Vision logic has to do with ego construct awareness. Construct awareness has more to do with what Campbell and Peterson and Nietzsche are talking about, the relative nature of language and symbolism. And ego awareness has to do with this transpersonal or existential awakening that Sam is talking about when he speaks about meditation and things like that. This ability to be able to transcend the mythology that we've built around our concept of a self. And to some extent, I think, to be able to see ourselves in a more modern, rational context, taking into account the micro and macro scales, where we know that there's a whole ecosystem of life happening just in my mouth right now, and that I'm a part of this larger ecosystem of a culture and a world and a society. And so to see yourself as a larger part of the process of evolution moving through you, that I actually think is a much more enlightened narrative of who and what you are than this old school way of thinking about individual selves, which I think correlates pretty well to the idea of individual souls. And when I say enlightened in that context, I don't just mean in the Eastern sense, I also mean in the Western sense. This realization of unity and interconnectedness, that's the point at which the Eastern and Western Enlightenment projects kind of converge. And especially if we can realize that the map is not the territory, then they converge quite nicely. So there are 3 stages to vision logic: early, mid, and late stage vision logic. At early stages of vision logic, you start to realize the metaphoric, poetic truth in these symbols, the deep resonance and power that they have, but you don't necessarily yet have the distinctions to be able to separate the pre from the trans. At the mid-stage, the integral level, you start to integrate diversity with discernment. That's where we get out of this kind of flat land of it's all relative, it's all whatever, and start to make some clear distinctions. We have all the world's relative knowledge on the table, and we can start to look for overarching patterns and themes. And most of this is for our own ability to try to figure things out. At the late stage of vision logic, we start to take these ideas out into the world, systematize them, and more skillfully deal with people on their own level. Engage with society and the conversation skillfully, as opposed to the way that often happens at earlier stages of cognitive development where everyone thinks they have the one true way and they want to force everyone into that. At this stage of development, we realize that everyone is growing and maturing at their own pace, and everyone only has their own symbol sets and ideas to work with. So instead of getting mad at someone for where they're at, we're just going to try to engage to the best of our ability with the most realistic expectations given the time and appropriateness to work with people and cultures and the world right where it's at. So we got these 3 stages of vision logic. The first stage is all about deconstructing everything. The second stage is about reconstructing and integrating diversity with discernment. And then the third stage is about a skillful systemization and application of those ideas in the world. So next, Sam asks, why not just take what's useful? I think to some extent we should take what's useful, but in a skillful way. We want to be multilingual. We want to be able to speak the language of all these traditions, so that way at the third stage of this vision logic we can be skillful in talking to people at whatever stage in the world. Why call yourself a Christian? Sam asks. And I don't know why Peterson would call himself a Christian, because clearly he does use a lot of this other type of symbolism. I think at a certain point, if you really have this trans-rational view, and then you just pick one tradition, then you just become the ultimate nerd for one type of symbolism, like everything gets reduced back to Star Wars metaphors or something. And that's almost a type of symbol set absolutism, and that's actually what we're trying to avoid in this. In fact, I would argue that we shouldn't necessarily be calling ourselves a Christian or a Buddhist or anything like that if we really get the point of these traditions. We should say, I am Christ, or I am Buddha. I am Stardust. I am the universe conscious of itself. Most of these creedal traditions have their non-dual archetype like this. Jesus, Buddha, the Baphomet. Sam Harris says, Buddhism isn't as superstitious. Well, if only that were true. Go to India. Buddhism is just as superstitious, unfortunately, because, again, it has to do with the stage of cognitive development of the person who's interpreting it, not the tradition or the symbolism itself. In fact, the early Christians, the Gnostics and the Essenes, for them, gnosis was this thing that couldn't be spoken about. It was this experience that you had to have for yourself, and then it was beyond words, which is really the opposite of dogma. And the ideas of heaven and hell are very much like Buddhist ideas of nirvana and samsara, as this psychological position. For example, in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, the disciples come to Jesus and they say, "When will the kingdom of the Father come?" And he says to them, "It will not come by expectation. You will not say, it is here or it is there. But the kingdom of my Father is spread amongst the earth, and people do not see it. They have ears, but they don't hear. They have eyes, but they don't see." In other words, it's a psychological position. At one-ment, atonement, unity, I and the Father are one. Or ego, separateness, and pride, the fall. Very, very similar language to the language of Buddhism. Jesus on his tree and Buddha under his tree are the same image, metaphorically, the one who's died to the flesh, who's died to the ego, and been reborn of the spirit, rededicated themselves to living for and as the absolute. So lastly is this point on deluding yourself into thinking, I'm Batman, or I'm the Christ. And at what point
would you actually be a bodhisattva? Super interesting questions, something I think that we really all should be pondering, because really this is the ultimate appropriate use of this symbolism. The idea is to connect you some way to this ultimate source of reality and to help you to participate in what evolution or spirit through time is trying to do. Speaking about spirit in a very poetic way there. This project of trying to be your best self, if these symbol sets can get you to take on that project and to live in the path of integrity, that's awesome. I don't know what in the modern rational tradition we have that is comparable to that, really. In contemporary Orthodox Christianity, generally the closest you can get to that is something like, what would Jesus do? You have to pray to it or have vicarious atonement to it. You can't say, I and the Father are one, as Jesus said. That is blasphemy. And that's the problem with the literal historical reading of the text, too. It becomes some true event that you have to worship or give reverence to, as opposed to this living word that's supposed to be speaking about our life and how we live today. It's not Jesus that's in the desert or Buddha that's in the forest being tempted. It's us. And how are we going to live? Are we just going to live for our egos, temporary personal satisfaction, or political power? Or are we going to live for the absolute? Are we going to live for God? Are we going to live for the body of Christ? Part of the reason I'm a big fan of Sam Harris is because, for me, he is an archetype of intellectual honesty and integrity. That's why I have so much respect for him. And for you people out there who don't like Sam personally, I would encourage you to go check out what Harris has to say in his afterthoughts about these Peterson talks. He is unhappy with how people have been saying mean things about Peterson. He's like, criticize the ideas if you want. Criticize my ideas if you want. But don't insult people personally. So he invites you to criticize him. He doesn't want the personal attacks. He wants us to engage with the conversation. He wants us to take part in the process. And this is kind of the point that they end on, that it's important to put yourself out there with integrity and honesty. Transforming the mind is possible. And yes, these projects of mythology and whatnot are orthogonal to science. They're a different project than what science is doing. But this emphasis on clear-headed thinking and respectful listening is a way for us all to engage in the human conversation and to grow. And I feel really blessed to be a part of this conversation. I appreciate you if you listened for this long. And I agree. I think it's super important. And what a classy and skillful way for these two guys to end this conversation on this agreed point, this mutual resonance around trying to have integrity, trying to communicate to the best of your ability what you think is true, and refining our ideas through this process of communication together. All right, so let's see. A couple last things at the end. I just want to say at this point, Sam, if you're watching, that you should have me on your podcast to talk more about integral ideas and distinctions, and maybe also the potential problems and pitfalls in our community and how I could see it fixing some of those ideas and taking these ideas further into the world, and the potential that the integral movement and integral projects have. I think that would be right up your alley. And if you're watching this and you would be interested in hearing that podcast, maybe hit Sam up, tell him to watch this video, tell him that he should have me on. But let's do a summary and then we'll wrap it up. So, in closing, what have we figured out? We figured out in part one that there's all of these different aspects to truth, all these different approaches to getting at different types of truth. There's absolute and relative truth. And within the relative truth, there's subjective and objective truth. Within objective truth, there's facts and theories. All of these are different and have their own methodologies and approaches. Sam tends to include them all, but he also might need to make stronger distinctions between the objective and the absolute. Peterson seems to be a lower left quadrant reductionist, and his ideas are kind of incoherent, which I honestly think had a real negative impact on the whole talk. In fact, I've tried to listen to some of Peterson's other talks where he talks in his classroom and he gives his lectures. I remember I was watching the first lecture and I was about 45 minutes into the lecture and I was thinking to myself, when is it going to begin? Is this the lecture?
He hasn't even like laid out any outline or said today we're going to be talking about this, and like made any distinctions. It's very much like this talk. It's just like meandering around, and honestly, I don't know how this guy is a professional teacher. Listen, if you're out there and you're the dean of some college or something, you should give me an honorary degree, because I will teach classes way better than this Peterson guy. Wow, I cannot believe this man is a professional teacher, a scholar, and yet he has such problems giving any kind of an outline or moving through things in an organized way. This dude needs to sit down and organize his thoughts. Or maybe at least share some of the organizational structure of his thoughts with the people who are listening so that way they can follow. Like right now I'm doing a summary at the end. We've moved through in a kind of a structured way, so hopefully you could follow. If Peterson did that and made some distinctions, he would be a lot more powerful and coherent of a figure in the world. In part 2, I found a lot of Sam's responses to be kind of a letdown. Kind of like, really, Sam? Really? But on the other hand, I do think that maybe he's asking a lot of these questions because he knows that his listeners are thinking these questions and wanting to ask these questions. So maybe he's in part asking them on their behalf. But it does seem like Sam Harris still doesn't really see the value and importance of this symbolism. I hope he comes around to it, because in terms of going back to vision logic and ego construct awareness, it seems like he's got a good firm grasp of the ego awareness. His perspective is transpersonal, but it still seems like he still might have a little bit of work to do in the transrational or post-formal domain, deconstructing and recontextualizing the map. So, that said, check out my videos, like this video, subscribe. Thanks for watching. Peace.
Yes.
Peace, 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 peace. Peace.
A kind of word salad of jargon, used out of context, inappropriately, apparently uncomprehending.
Peace. Peace.
Well, as you can see, the opponents of free speech are capable of making a lot of inarticulate noise.
Peace.
Don't do that again.
Peace. Peace about it. Peace.
It was very peaceful, so hooray! Yeah.
Peace.